Västerud. There are two different ways. One shorter and one longer. We are not taking the shorter. It's only 1.8 kilometers, just over a mile. It's a little chillier today. Not temperature-wise, but... So I think this is a popular destination, and they advertise it quite a lot. Yeah, and I saw a whole bunch of black grouse on the road. Moose been walking here? These roads are really soft. But that is because the ground here is sand. And here we have two markers. Yellow as well. So I think the yellow is the one we are supposed to follow later. Let's hope we get back to the view of the lake. Pond. Water. Yeah, I have my system camera really accessible. Because, you know, the best camera in the world is the one you have with you, and they're easy to pick up. Now, so this is the last trek for the week. Our 6th. So, yeah. The legs are not tired, but they are feeling it. And I suppose Aamu has the same. He sleeps much. Yes, we have a trail marker beyond. So this is the return. You have the orange markers as well. Oh yeah. There's the marshland. Marshes on both sides. Very easy to walk. Very serene. But we don't see much of the bog. I was a little afraid that it would be wet. There's a lot of these steep. Oh, this is a ridge. This could actually be Ice Age. Actually, it could be. And the glaciers put through. Moved a lot of material. Yeah, I think we are walking around the marsh. Small creek to the left. You're holding a healthy tempo, Aamu, do you know? We saw a bit of snow on the way up, Aamu, but we haven't seen anything here. See nothing in that direction. Yeah. This way it is. Moose. K9. Fresh K9. Normally, I would assume dog. Not here. Well, I guess it is a dog. The footprints are the same age. Very cleared. Smaller trees here. We give room for the new Yeah, that's often the problem with a longer trail, is that you pretty much are on road. That's how they make the trails longer. You don't have to keep them. Completely understandable. That's a good tip. Go to a place where you have many different trails. Go for 2 5-6 kilometers instead of 1 10 to 12 kilometers. Does it turn off here? I wouldn't think so. Ah, there is sign. No marking, Aurora. I'm going to take this side down. We want to drink. I will not trust those sticks. And here, I think the trail turns. This looks very walked. Markers. I will probably go up from the ridge there. Yeah, maybe we'll get a better view now. The trail turns, Aamu. Trail turned. No snow, Aamu. Could it be that bad that we don't get any snow? But this is easy enough to follow. They have marked it quite well. Well, not as scenic as I thought it would be, given how popular this place is. As you can see, it's white on the ground. It's not snow, it's lichen. Here's a bench, Aamu. I think we take this. It looks really wet, but also has a nice view. Because here we have food for Daddy and cheesecake for you. Food for Daddy and your food. We're sniffing, Daddy. There you go. Oh, there's someone is smoking here. If only your footprints. Don't like your duck rack stick? Yeah, now we're taking. No, you just removed it. I was in the way, Aamu. Yeah, it's kind of nice. Yeah, you ate all the chicken hearts. I also know that Aamu is waiting to come home. Because I have cheesecake. I have cheesecake with her. I learned something. Aamu likes cheesecake. You don't eat that, Aamu. The bird is gonna get it. Those squirrels. Or the rodents. So you know if wolves maybe eat cheesecake. I would think they do. I don't think wolves are as picky with the food as you are. You want some deer. You don't like this. We tested so many times, Aamu. It's Christmas ham. You don't eat that. This is deer. Yeah, and you have it in your bowl. And she's been sitting there for a couple of minutes. And as soon as we walk, she finds something really interesting. Why didn't you look at that earlier? you. Really nice of you. I'm just really content. It was a little sad that the snow disappeared, but we had quite a lot of snow when we came, and we got snow on Christmas Eve. And you've seen snow every day except today. This part was nice. Ice here. Actually, first bit of ice we had on the trail. So now we're climbing the next ridge. I wonder if that was a shortcut. The other one. Tape it off. No, it actually continues to the right. Oh, we are still on the yellow trail. I can see the trail over there. Yeah, and there comes the shortcut. Aamu, that way. Coming right up to the marshes now. This side. Well, we haven't seen a soul. I think they walk the same direction as us. So tomorrow we'll be traveling home. Are we going to go on the side of that? The first little bridge. Yeah, and here you have the rest. Oh. So here is the proper rest, Aamu, who turns immediately that way. Långtjärn. It is. Some sceneries, yeah. You're not having a break now. Sweetie. Sweetie, wrong way. Gone that way. Well, yeah, I pointed that direction, I agree. This is the trail, so Gräsjön, which we were, is 16.3 from here. So this is Svartån. Black Creek Trail, which we have walked a massive amount of. Okay. Next to the nature reserve. Yeah, so they are fixing the place up. They're maintaining it. Okay, we get signs. That means that we probably are back on the short. Two buddies. So that's why we got the orange trail markers as well. Because Svartån goes here. We are very close now. Yeah, now we are rejoining. Yes, we come down here. Exactly what I guessed, actually. When I saw the sign here, I kind of figured that it wasn't the same way back. And there's my car. It's very dirty. Do you want some snow, Aamu? I see snow. Very, very little snow. I've been there. Snow. It's mostly ice, but still snow. Zero interest. Oh, it's a nice one. A nice, easy one.